In the grand tapestry of human thought, few figures shine as brilliantly as Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. Born in the Persian town of Tus in 1058, this remarkable man would become known as Hujjat al-Islam, the proof of Islam, a title that barely captures the enormity of his intellectual and spiritual contributions to humanity. Al-Ghazali stands as perhaps the most complete thinker in Islamic history, a man who mastered every field of knowledge available in his time, only to transcend them all in pursuit of ultimate truth. What makes Al-Ghazali extraordinary is not merely his brilliance, though his intelligence was legendary. Nor is it simply his productivity, although he authored over 70 books on subjects ranging from Islamic law to mystical psychology. What sets him apart is the radical honesty with which he approached the deepest questions of human existence, and his willingness to sacrifice everything, including his prestigious career and worldly success, in pursuit of genuine certainty about the nature of reality and the path to true happiness. His philosophy emerges from one of the most dramatic intellectual and spiritual crises in recorded history. At the height of his fame, while serving as the most prestigious professor in the Islamic world, Al-Ghazali experienced a profound skeptical awakening that shattered every assumption he had held about knowledge, reality, and truth. This crisis could have destroyed him, as it has destroyed many brilliant minds throughout history. Instead, it became the foundation for a philosophical synthesis that would influence not only Islamic thought, but Jewish, Christian, and even modern secular philosophy for nearly 1,000 years. Al-Ghazali's genius lies in his ability to integrate seemingly contradictory approaches to truth. He was simultaneously a rigorous logician and a profound mystic, a sharp critic of philosophical overreach and a sophisticated philosophical thinker, a defender of orthodox religious teaching and a revolutionary reformer of religious understanding. He showed how skeptical doubt could become a tool for discovering unshakable certainty, how rational inquiry could prepare the ground for mystical experience, and how individual spiritual development could serve the larger purposes of community welfare and divine worship. The journey we are about to undertake through Al-Ghazali's complete philosophical system will reveal a mind of extraordinary depth and breadth. We will explore his revolutionary analysis of the foundations of knowledge, his systematic critique of the philosophical schools of his time, his masterful integration of Islamic law with Sufi mysticism, and his profound insights into the psychology of spiritual transformation. We will discover how he developed a theory of causation that anticipated modern philosophical developments by hundreds of years, and how his understanding of the relationship between reason and revelation offers solutions to problems that still perplex thinkers today. Most importantly, we will see how Al-Ghazali's philosophy provides a roadmap for human flourishing that addresses both our intellectual need for truth and our spiritual hunger for meaning and connection with the divine. His teachings remain as relevant today as they were 9 centuries ago, because they speak to perennial human concerns about knowledge, purpose, morality, and the possibility of genuine happiness in a complex and often confusing world. Part 1. The Architecture of Doubt. The story of Al-Ghazali's philosophical awakening reads like a thriller of the mind. Picture this. The year is 1095, and Al-Ghazali stands at the pinnacle of intellectual achievement in the medieval world. At only 37 years old, he holds the most prestigious academic position in Islam, the chief professorship at the Nizamiya University in Baghdad, where over 300 students hang on his every word. He has mastered Islamic law, theology, philosophy, and logic to such a degree that scholars travel from across the known world to study with him. Yet beneath this glittering exterior, a storm was brewing in Al-Ghazali's mind. As he later wrote in his spiritual autobiography, Deliverance from Error, he began to question not just specific beliefs or arguments, but the very foundations of human knowledge itself. This was not the casual skepticism of someone playing intellectual games, but a devastating crisis that struck at the heart of everything he thought he knew about reality. The crisis began with a simple but profound question. How can we be certain that what we believe to be true actually corresponds to reality? Al-Ghazali realized that most people accept beliefs simply because they have been taught them by authorities they trust. Children believe what their parents tell them, students accept what their teachers say, and religious believers follow what their clergy teaches. But what if these authorities are wrong? What if entire traditions of learning are built on false assumptions that no one has bothered to examine carefully? This led Al-Ghazali to examine the foundations of sense experience. We tend to trust our senses as reliable sources of information about the external world. We see the sun rising in the east and setting in the west, and we conclude that the sun moves around the earth. We put our hand in water and feel wetness, so we assume that wetness is an inherent property of water. But Al-Ghazali knew that our senses can deceive us in dramatic ways. Objects appear smaller when they are far away, straight sticks look bent when placed in water, and dreams can seem completely real while we are experiencing them. If our senses can deceive us about simple physical facts, how much more might they mislead us about complex questions concerning the nature of reality, the existence of God, or the proper way to live? Perhaps what we take to be the waking world is itself a kind of dream, and what we consider solid reality is nothing more than an elaborate illusion. But the skeptical crisis went even deeper. Al-Ghazali turned his penetrating analysis toward the foundations of rational thought itself. Most educated people, then as now, place great confidence in the power of human reason to discover truth through logical analysis and mathematical demonstration. Mathematical truths seem especially certain. 2 + 2 = 4, the angles of a triangle always add up to 180 degrees, and the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. Yet even here Al-Ghazali found grounds for doubt. How do we know that the logical principles we use in reasoning actually correspond to the structure of reality? Perhaps the law of non-contradiction, which says that something cannot both be and not be at the same time, is just a limitation of human thinking rather than a fundamental feature of the universe. Perhaps there are forms of reality that transcend the categories of human logic, making our most confident rational conclusions irrelevant to the ultimate nature of things. The psychological impact of these doubts was devastating. Al-Ghazali describes how the crisis affected him physically, making it impossible for him to teach or even speak coherently about the subjects he had previously mastered. He would stand before his students, mouth open, unable to utter the words that had once flowed so easily. The foundations of his entire intellectual edifice had crumbled, leaving him in a state of paralyzing uncertainty about everything he had previously taken for granted. What makes Al-Ghazali's skeptical crisis historically significant is not just its psychological intensity, but its methodical thoroughness. He was not content to doubt randomly or superficially, but developed a systematic approach to questioning that would later influence skeptical traditions in both Islamic and European philosophy. He distinguished between different types of knowledge claims and subjected each to rigorous analysis. He examined the logical structure of arguments, the reliability of different sources of information, and the hidden assumptions that underlie even our most basic beliefs about reality. This methodical doubt was not an end in itself, but a tool for discovering what, if anything, could withstand the most rigorous skeptical scrutiny. Al-Ghazali was searching for a foundation of knowledge so solid that no reasonable doubt could shake it. He wanted to find a bedrock of certainty upon which he could rebuild his understanding of reality, knowledge, and the proper conduct of life. The breakthrough came in a moment of divine illumination that Al-Ghazali describes as a light cast into his heart by God. This was not a rejection of reason, but rather the discovery of a more fundamental foundation that makes rational inquiry possible and meaningful. He realized that the capacity for rational thought itself depends on assumptions that cannot be proven by reason alone. The very fact that we can doubt analyze and seek truth presupposes the existence of a thinking subject and the possibility of distinguishing between truth and falsehood. But this foundational certainty was not merely intellectual. It came with a direct experiential awareness of the divine reality that underlies and sustains all existence. Al-Ghazali discovered that the deepest truths about reality cannot be grasped through purely theoretical analysis, but require a transformation of consciousness that involves the whole human being, mind, heart and soul. This discovery became the foundation for everything that followed in Al-Ghazali's philosophical development. It provided him with a criterion for evaluating different approaches to knowledge, a method for integrating rational inquiry with spiritual experience, and a vision of human fulfillment that goes beyond both intellectual satisfaction and worldly success. The skeptical crisis that could have destroyed his intellectual life instead became the catalyst for a philosophical synthesis of unprecedented scope and depth. Al-Ghazali's skeptical method differed from modern skepticism in crucial ways. While many modern skeptics use doubt as a way of avoiding commitment to any substantive beliefs about reality, Al-Ghazali used doubt as a tool for discovering unshakable foundations for belief and action. His skepticism was therapeutic rather than corrosive, designed to cure the mind of false certainties so that it could be open to genuine knowledge. He understood that doubt and certainty are not permanent psychological states, but phases in the mind's journey toward truth. The influence of Al-Ghazali's skeptical method extended far beyond his own philosophical system. Later, Islamic philosophers had to grapple with the challenges he raised, leading to more sophisticated analyses of the foundations of knowledge and the relationship between reason and revelation. Medieval Jewish and Christian thinkers who encountered his works through Latin translations were forced to develop more nuanced approaches to questions about faith and reason. Even modern European philosophers like Descartes, who probably never read Al-Ghazali directly, developed methods of systematic doubt that show remarkable similarities to his approach. What makes Al-Ghazali's skepticism particularly powerful is that it emerges from genuine spiritual and intellectual hunger rather than mere academic curiosity. He was not playing intellectual games or showing off his analytical skills, but wrestling with fundamental questions about the meaning and purpose of human existence. His doubt was existential as well as epistemological, touching not only what he could know with certainty, but how he should live and what he should ultimately care about. This existential dimension gives Al-Ghazali's skepticism an urgency and depth that purely academic skepticism often lacks. He understood that skeptical doubt, if left unresolved, can lead to moral paralysis and spiritual despair. If we cannot know anything with certainty, how can we make important decisions about how to live? If all beliefs are equally doubtful, what prevents us from sliding into nihilism or relativism? Al-Ghazali's answer was that genuine skepticism, pursued with complete honesty and courage, ultimately leads beyond itself to a form of knowledge that transcends the limitations of purely human reasoning. The light that God cast into his heart was not an arbitrary revelation that bypassed rational inquiry, but the culmination of rational inquiry pushed to its ultimate limits. When reason reaches the boundaries of what it can accomplish on its own, it opens itself to forms of knowledge that include but transcend purely logical analysis. This insight became central to Al-Ghazali's mature philosophy. He showed how reason and revelation, philosophical inquiry and mystical experience, individual doubt and communal tradition could work together in the search for truth rather than competing with each other. His skeptical method cleared away false certainties and intellectual pride, creating space for the kind of humble, receptive awareness that is necessary for genuine knowledge of ultimate reality. Part 2. The Four Paths Examined. Having emerged from his skeptical crisis with a new foundation of certainty, Al-Ghazali embarked on the most systematic investigation of human knowledge ever attempted by a medieval thinker. He identified 4 major approaches that people use in their search for truth, and he resolved to master each one completely before passing judgment on its validity and limitations. This was not the casual survey of an academic dilettante, but the methodical investigation of a man whose very sanity depended on finding genuine answers to ultimate questions. The first path he examined was that of the theologians, the mutakallimun, who used rational arguments to defend religious doctrines against philosophical and sectarian challenges. Al-Ghazali had been trained in this tradition and knew its strengths intimately. The theologians had developed sophisticated logical techniques for demonstrating the existence of God, proving the possibility of miracles, and showing the rational coherence of revealed teachings. Their arguments could silence skeptics and provide intellectual satisfaction to believers troubled by philosophical doubts. Yet as Al-Ghazali delved deeper into theological methodology, he discovered fundamental limitations that prevented it from providing the kind of certain knowledge his soul craved. The theologians typically began with assumptions drawn from religious tradition, then used logical arguments to defend these assumptions against objections. But what if the original assumptions were questionable? Moreover, theological arguments often dealt with abstract concepts rather than the living reality of divine presence that transforms human consciousness. They could prove that God exists, but they could not provide direct experience of God's reality. Al-Ghazali realized that theology, for all its logical sophistication, remained a defensive discipline rather than a path to genuine knowledge. It could protect existing beliefs from attack, but it could not generate the kind of transformative understanding that changes how a person sees reality and lives in the world. Theological knowledge remained external to the knower, a collection of propositions to be believed rather than truths to be experienced. The second path led into the fascinating and dangerous world of Islamic philosophy, particularly the Aristotelian tradition as developed by brilliant thinkers like Al-Farabi and Avicenna. Al-Ghazali threw himself into philosophical study with characteristic thoroughness, mastering not only the conclusions of the philosophers, but their methods of inquiry and their fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality and knowledge. He was so successful in this endeavour that his summary of philosophical teachings, The Aims of the Philosophers, was later mistaken by some European readers for an endorsement of philosophical positions rather than a preparatory work for his critique. What impressed Al-Ghazali about the philosophers was their commitment to rational demonstration and their refusal to accept any proposition that could not be proven through logical analysis. In mathematics, logic, and natural science, they had achieved remarkable results by following evidence wherever it led, regardless of whether the conclusions supported popular beliefs or traditional authorities. Their work in astronomy had revealed the true motions of celestial bodies, their investigations in medicine had uncovered the causes of diseases, and their logical analyses had clarified the principles of valid reasoning. But when the philosophers moved beyond these empirical and logical domains into metaphysical questions about the ultimate nature of reality, Al-Ghazali detected a fatal flaw in their approach. They claimed the same certainty for their metaphysical speculations that they had achieved in mathematics and logic. But their arguments about the eternity of the world, the nature of divine knowledge, and the destiny of human souls were based on unproven assumptions rather than demonstrative proof. Different philosophical schools reached contradictory conclusions about these ultimate questions, suggesting that philosophical method alone was insufficient for resolving them. More troubling still was the tendency of philosophers to subordinate revealed truth to rational speculation. When philosophical conclusions conflicted with clear teachings of revelation, the philosophers typically assumed that revelation must be reinterpreted to conform to philosophical requirements, rather than considering the possibility that reason might have limitations that revelation could transcend. This philosophical arrogance struck Al-Ghazali as both intellectually unjustified and spiritually dangerous. The third path involved the esoteric claims of the Ismaili movement, which taught that true knowledge was available only to a select elite who had received secret teachings from divinely inspired leaders. The Ismailis promised to resolve all intellectual and spiritual difficulties through access to hidden knowledge that ordinary believers could never discover through their own efforts. This appealed to Al-Ghazali's desire for certain knowledge, and he investigated their claims with the same thoroughness he had applied to theology and philosophy. What he discovered was a system based on circular reasoning and unsupported assertions. The Ismailis claimed authority based on their possession of secret knowledge, but when pressed to demonstrate this knowledge, they could only point back to their claims of authority. Their teachings often contradicted established facts that could be verified independently, and their leaders showed no evidence of possessing the kind of transformative wisdom that genuine spiritual knowledge should produce. Al-Ghazali concluded that Ismailism was a sophisticated form of intellectual fraud that exploited people's hunger for certainty without providing genuine satisfaction. The fourth path led into the mysterious realm of Sufism, the mystical tradition within Islam that promised direct experience of divine reality rather than mere intellectual knowledge about God. Initially, Al-Ghazali approached Sufism with the same analytical mindset he had applied to the other paths, studying Sufi texts and interviewing Sufi practitioners to understand their methods and evaluate their claims. But he quickly realized that Sufism could not be adequately understood from the outside, as a purely intellectual exercise. The Sufis claimed that their knowledge came through direct spiritual experience, achieved through disciplined practices of meditation, prayer, moral purification, and complete surrender to divine will. This knowledge was not theoretical but practical, not abstract but experiential, not external but intimately personal. They insisted that someone who had not undergone the transformative disciplines of the spiritual path could no more understand mystical knowledge than a person who had never tasted sweetness could understand descriptions of honey. This presented Al-Ghazali with a dilemma. His analytical method required him to evaluate Sufi claims from a position of intellectual detachment, but the Sufis insisted that their teachings could only be validated through personal spiritual transformation. How could he assess the truth of mystical claims without compromising the objectivity that had served him so well in his investigation of the other paths? The resolution came through a remarkable act of intellectual courage. Al-Ghazali decided that genuine inquiry into Sufism required him to become a practitioner rather than merely an observer. In November of 1095, at the height of his academic career, he abandoned his prestigious position, distributed his wealth, and embarked on the path of mystical discipline and spiritual purification. This was not the decision of a man fleeing from intellectual challenges, but of a thinker so committed to finding truth that he was willing to risk everything, including his reputation and financial security, in pursuit of genuine knowledge. What Al-Ghazali discovered through this direct investigation of Sufism transformed not only his understanding of mystical experience, but his entire conception of knowledge and reality. He found that the Sufi path provided access to forms of certainty that transcended the limitations of theological argument, philosophical speculation, and esoteric claims. But this mystical knowledge was not anti-rational or irrational. Rather, it provided the foundation that made rational inquiry meaningful and effective. The light of divine illumination did not eliminate the need for careful thinking, but rather showed how thinking could serve higher purposes than mere intellectual satisfaction. Part 3. The Grand Synthesis. The masterwork that emerged from Al-Ghazali's systematic investigation of different paths to knowledge stands as one of the most ambitious intellectual achievements in human history. The revival of the religious sciences consists of 40 books organized into 4 major sections, each containing 10 books that explore different aspects of the integrated spiritual life. But to call this simply a work of religious instruction would be like calling Beethoven's Ninth Symphony merely a piece of music. Al-Ghazali created nothing less than a complete manual for human transformation, showing how every aspect of ordinary life can become a vehicle for spiritual development and direct knowledge of ultimate reality. The scope and depth of this work reflects Al-Ghazali's recognition that genuine spiritual development cannot be separated from the practical challenges of living in the world. He understood that most people are not called to become monks or hermits, abandoning worldly responsibilities in pursuit of mystical experience. Instead, they must find ways to integrate spiritual awareness with the demands of family life, social obligations, economic necessities, and civic duties. The revival shows how this integration is not only possible, but necessary for complete human development. The first quarter of the work, dealing with acts of worship, reveals Al-Ghazali's genius for uncovering the profound spiritual psychology hidden within familiar religious practices. Take the example of ritual prayer, which many people perform mechanically without understanding its deeper significance. Al-Ghazali shows how each element of the prayer ritual is designed to produce specific psychological and spiritual effects that purify the heart and align consciousness with divine reality. The physical movements train the body in attitudes of humility and reverence. The recitation of sacred texts fills the mind with divine truth, and the regular timing of prayers throughout the day creates a rhythm of remembrance that prevents spiritual forgetfulness. But Al-Ghazali goes far deeper than external analysis of ritual forms. He explores the inner dimensions of prayer, showing how the sincere practitioner can use this daily discipline to achieve states of consciousness in which the boundary between self and divine reality begins to dissolve. Prayer becomes not just a duty to be performed, but a method of spiritual transformation that can lead to direct experience of the divine presence. Yet, this mystical dimension never eliminates the practical benefits of prayer as a discipline that structures daily life and maintains connection with the religious community. Similarly, his treatment of charity reveals how acts of economic generosity can become vehicles for overcoming the spiritual disease of attachment to material wealth. Al-Ghazali analyzes the psychology of greed and shows how the practice of giving away money and possessions gradually liberates the heart from the illusion that security and happiness depend on accumulating material goods. But he also provides detailed practical guidance about how much to give, to whom, under what circumstances, and with what intentions. The mystical and the practical are seamlessly integrated throughout his analysis. The second quarter, dealing with social customs and daily life habits, demonstrates Al-Ghazali's conviction that spiritual development must encompass all aspects of human experience. He provides detailed guidance on everything from table manners to sexual ethics, from business practices to relationships with neighbors. But this is not legalistic nitpicking about external rules. Rather, it reflects his understanding that every human action either contributes to spiritual purification or increases spiritual pollution. There is no neutral ground in the battle between higher and lower tendencies within the human soul. His discussion of marriage exemplifies this approach. Al-Ghazali analyzes marriage simultaneously as a social institution, a psychological relationship, a biological partnership, and a spiritual discipline. He shows how sexual intimacy between spouses can become a form of worship when approached with the right awareness and intentions, how raising children can serve as training in unconditional love, and how the challenges of family life can become opportunities for developing patience, forgiveness, and selflessness. Yet he also provides practical advice about choosing a spouse, managing household finances, and resolving marital conflicts. The third quarter, examining qualities that lead to spiritual destruction, represents perhaps Al-Ghazali's most psychologically sophisticated analysis. He identifies and dissects the major spiritual diseases that prevent the heart from achieving its natural clarity and receptivity to divine light. But his approach is neither moralistic condemnation nor abstract philosophical analysis. Instead, he provides detailed psychological investigation of how destructive qualities develop, how they reinforce each other, and how they can be gradually transformed. His analysis of pride, for example, reveals it as perhaps the most dangerous of all spiritual diseases because it corrupts the very faculty of spiritual discernment that should guide the seeker toward truth. The proud person becomes incapable of recognizing their own limitations or accepting guidance from others, making genuine spiritual progress impossible. Al-Ghazali traces the subtle ways that pride can disguise itself as virtue, how intellectual achievement can become a source of spiritual blindness, and how even religious accomplishments can feed the ego rather than purifying it. But he does not leave the reader paralyzed by awareness of these dangers. Instead, he provides specific practices and mental disciplines that can gradually undermine the foundations of pride and cultivate genuine humility. He shows how regular self-examination can reveal the self-deceptive tendencies of the ego, how service to others can break down barriers of self-centeredness, and how remembrance of death can put personal achievements in proper perspective. The fourth quarter, Exploring Qualities That Lead to Salvation, represents Al-Ghazali's positive vision of human spiritual potential. Here he describes the higher states of consciousness that become possible when the heart has been purified of destructive qualities and open to divine influence. But again, his approach combines practical guidance with profound mystical insight. He shows how qualities like patience, gratitude, trust in God, and love of the divine can be systematically cultivated through specific practices and mental disciplines. His treatment of repentance illustrates this integration of the practical and the mystical. At one level, repentance involves recognition of wrongdoing, genuine remorse, seeking forgiveness, and firm resolution to avoid similar mistakes in the future. But Al-Ghazali shows how true repentance goes much deeper, involving a fundamental reorientation of consciousness away from reliance on personal will and toward complete dependence on divine mercy. The deepest repentance is not just sorrow for particular sins, but recognition of the fundamental inadequacy of human effort apart from divine grace. This recognition leads naturally into the highest stages of spiritual development, where individual will becomes transparent to divine will and personal consciousness expands to include direct awareness of ultimate reality. Yet Al-Ghazali never treats these advanced spiritual states as escapes from ordinary human responsibilities. Instead, he shows how mystical realization enhances rather than eliminates the capacity for effective action in the world. The person who has achieved direct knowledge of divine reality becomes more, not less, capable of serving others and fulfilling the legitimate demands of social existence. Part 4. The Incoherence Unveiled. In 1095, the same year he abandoned his prestigious academic career, Al-Ghazali completed what would become one of the most influential philosophical works in history, The Incoherence of the Philosophers. This devastating critique of Aristotelian philosophy sent shockwaves through the intellectual world that are still reverberating today. Yet the work is widely misunderstood, often portrayed as an anti-rational attack on philosophical inquiry itself rather than what it actually represents, a surgical precision strike against specific philosophical claims that Al-Ghazali believed violated both logical rigor and spiritual truth. To understand the true significance of the incoherence, we must appreciate the intellectual context in which it appeared. The Islamic world of Al-Ghazali's time was dominated by brilliant philosophers who had absorbed and developed the Aristotelian tradition with remarkable sophistication. Thinkers like Al-Farabi and Avicenna had created comprehensive philosophical systems that claimed to provide rational demonstrations of fundamental truths about God, the universe, and human destiny. These philosophers enjoyed enormous prestige among educated Muslims, and had influenced even religious scholars who should have been more suspicious of purely rational approaches to ultimate questions. Al-Ghazali's genius was to attack the philosophers using their own weapons. Rather than rejecting philosophical method altogether, he demonstrated that the philosophers themselves had violated the logical standards they claimed to follow. He showed that their most confident conclusions about metaphysical questions were based on unproven assumptions rather than genuine demonstrations, and that their arguments contained logical fallacies that would be obvious if applied to less exalted subjects. The work is organized around 20 specific philosophical positions that Al-Ghazali subjects to detailed logical analysis. But 3 of these positions are singled out as so dangerous that anyone who holds them should be considered an unbeliever whose blood may legitimately be shed. These 3 positions strike at the heart of theistic religion and cannot be reconciled with genuine belief in God as understood by the revealed traditions. The first heretical position concerns the eternity of the world. The philosophers argued that the universe has always existed as an eternal emanation from the divine essence, without beginning in time and without the possibility of ending. Al-Ghazali recognized that this position, however sophisticated its philosophical justification, eliminates any meaningful sense of divine creation and reduces God to a merely formal cause rather than the free, personal creator described in revealed scripture. If the world is eternal, then God did not choose to create it, cannot alter its fundamental structure, and bears no personal responsibility for its existence. Al-Ghazali's refutation of this position reveals his sophisticated understanding of both philosophy and theology. He shows that the philosophical arguments for eternity are based on questionable assumptions about the relationship between divine perfection and temporal action. The philosophers assumed that any change in God, including the decision to create the world at a particular moment, would imply imperfection or lack in the divine nature. But Al-Ghazali demonstrates that this assumption confuses change that results from external compulsion or internal need with free action that expresses divine will and wisdom. The second heretical position concerns the scope of divine knowledge. The philosophers claim that God knows only universal principles and eternal truths, but not the particular events that occur in the temporal world. According to this view, God knows the general laws that govern physical processes, but not whether a particular sparrow falls from a tree at a specific moment. This position seemed necessary to the philosophers because they could not conceive how an eternal, unchanging being could have knowledge of temporal, changing events without itself being subject to change. Al-Ghazali recognized that this philosophical sophistication comes at the cost of eliminating any meaningful relationship between God and the world. If God does not know particular events, then divine providence becomes meaningless, prayer becomes futile, and moral accountability becomes impossible. How can God reward good deeds and punish evil ones without knowing what particular individuals have actually done? Al-Ghazali shows that the philosophical concern about divine immutability reflects a confused understanding of what perfection means when applied to divine knowledge. The third heretical position involves the denial of bodily resurrection. The philosophers argued that only the rational soul survives death, while the body dissolves permanently into its constituent elements. They claimed that the Quranic descriptions of physical resurrection, heavenly pleasures, and hellish punishments should be interpreted allegorically as symbols of spiritual states, rather than literal descriptions of post-mortem existence. This position struck Al-Ghazali as both philosophically unjustified and religiously dangerous. Philosophically, it assumes that the relationship between soul and body is so external that the soul could exist in a completely disembodied state without losing essential aspects of personal identity. But human consciousness as we know it is intimately connected with bodily experience, and it is unclear how personal identity could be preserved without some form of embodied existence. Religiously, the denial of bodily resurrection eliminates the possibility of divine justice being fully realized in a future life, making moral effort seem ultimately meaningless. But Al-Ghazali's critique goes beyond these three specific positions to address the fundamental methodology of the philosophers. He shows that they claim the same degree of certainty for their metaphysical speculations that they achieve in mathematics and logic, but their metaphysical arguments do not meet the standards of demonstration that would justify such confidence. In mathematics, different practitioners reach the same conclusions because mathematical truths can be rigorously demonstrated from commonly accepted axioms. But in metaphysics, different philosophical schools reach contradictory conclusions, suggesting that their methods are inadequate for resolving ultimate questions about reality. This methodological critique leads Al-Ghazali to a profound analysis of the relationship between human reason and ultimate truth. He does not reject the use of reason in investigating metaphysical questions, but he insists that reason must recognize its own limitations and remain open to sources of knowledge that transcend purely logical analysis. The deepest truths about God, the universe, and human destiny cannot be captured in purely conceptual terms, but require the kind of direct, experiential knowledge that comes through spiritual transformation. Al-Ghazali's most philosophically sophisticated contribution to this debate concerns his analysis of causation. The philosophers claimed that there are necessary connections between causes and effects in the natural world, such that given the same causes, the same effects must inevitably follow. This claim seemed essential for making the world rationally intelligible and scientifically predictable, but Al-Ghazali detected a fundamental logical flaw in the argument. He points out that necessary connection cannot be directly observed, but must be inferred from repeated experience of regular sequences. When we see fire touch cotton and the cotton burn, we assume that fire necessarily causes burning. But all we actually observe is one event following another. The necessity that supposedly connects them is a mental construction rather than an empirical fact. Since cause and effect are logically distinct concepts, there is no logical contradiction in imagining them occurring separately, which suggests that their connection is contingent rather than necessary. This analysis leads Al-Ghazali to propose what became known as occasionalism, the view that God is the only genuine cause of all events in the natural world. What we interpret as natural causation is actually God's customary way of creating events in regular sequences that appear to us as cause and effect relationships. This preserves both the regularity that makes scientific investigation possible and the divine freedom that makes miracles possible. God typically follows consistent patterns in creating events, but he remains free to act differently when his wisdom determines that departure from the usual course would serve a higher purpose. Part 5. The Light of Illumination. Near the end of his extraordinary intellectual journey, Al-Ghazali produced a work that represents the highest synthesis of his philosophical and mystical insights, The Niche of Lights. Written in his mature years when decades of scholarly investigation and spiritual practice had reached their culmination, this remarkable text explores the deepest questions about the relationship between human consciousness and ultimate reality. The work takes its title and central imagery from the famous light verse of the Quran, but Al-Ghazali transforms this scriptural foundation into a comprehensive theory of knowledge that integrates rational analysis, mystical experience, and revealed truth. The central metaphor of light serves multiple functions in Al-Ghazali's analysis. At the most basic level, light represents the faculty of consciousness that makes knowledge possible. Just as physical light illuminates objects so that the eye can perceive them, spiritual light illuminates truth so that the mind can understand it. But Al-Ghazali goes much deeper than this simple analogy, developing a sophisticated analysis of different levels of reality and corresponding modes of knowledge. He distinguishes between three fundamental levels of existence, each requiring a different kind of illumination for proper understanding. The first level is the ordinary world of physical objects and sensory experience. This level can be investigated through empirical observation and rational analysis, the methods that natural philosophers and logicians employ with considerable success. The light that illuminates this level is the natural capacity of human reason, which can discover mathematical relationships, logical principles, and empirical regularities. But Al-Ghazali shows that this level of reality, however important for practical life, is ultimately dependent on higher levels that cannot be adequately understood through purely rational methods. The physical world is like shadows cast by more fundamental realities, and someone who mistakes shadows for ultimate truth will remain trapped in a cave of illusions. This imagery, reminiscent of Plato's famous cave allegory, reflects Al-Ghazali's conviction that most people live in a world of appearances rather than penetrating to the essential nature of reality. The second level consists of the realm of rational concepts, logical relationships, and mathematical truths. This is the domain that philosophers explore when they investigate questions about substance and accident, cause and effect, universal and particular, necessary and contingent. The light that illuminates this level is the higher intellectual faculty that can grasp abstract relationships and logical principles. Al-Ghazali acknowledges the value and legitimacy of this kind of investigation, but he insists that it too has limitations that prevent it from reaching ultimate truth. The fundamental limitation of purely rational knowledge is that it remains external to the knower. Even when reason discovers valid logical relationships or empirical regularities, this knowledge does not transform the consciousness of the knower in the way that direct experience does. Someone can understand logically that God exists and has certain attributes without this knowledge producing any real change in their spiritual condition or practical behavior. Rational knowledge about ultimate reality remains abstract and theoretical unless it is complemented by direct experiential knowledge. The third level is the realm of pure spiritual reality, accessible only through the kind of direct illumination that comes from divine grace, acting upon a consciousness that has been properly prepared through moral purification and spiritual discipline. This is not knowledge about God, but knowledge of God, not conceptual understanding of divine attributes, but direct awareness of divine presence. The light that illuminates this level is not produced by human effort alone, but represents the self-disclosure of ultimate reality to consciousness that has become transparent to divine influence. Al-Ghazali's analysis of this highest level of knowledge is particularly sophisticated because he avoids both the crude anthropomorphism that would reduce divine reality to human categories and the abstract conceptualism that would eliminate any meaningful relationship between God and human consciousness. He shows how direct spiritual knowledge involves a kind of participation in divine reality that transcends the subject-object distinction characteristic of ordinary experience without eliminating the distinction between creator and creature. The practical implications of this three-level analysis are profound. Al-Ghazali shows how genuine spiritual development requires the integration of all three levels, rather than the rejection of lower levels in favor of higher ones. Empirical observation and rational analysis provide necessary preparation for spiritual illumination by training consciousness in careful attention and logical discrimination. But they must be transcended, not abandoned, as consciousness opens itself to forms of knowledge that include but surpass purely human reasoning. This integration requires what Al-Ghazali calls the purification of the heart, a systematic process of moral and spiritual transformation that removes the obstacles preventing consciousness from receiving divine illumination. These obstacles include not only obvious moral failings like greed, hatred and pride, but subtle forms of intellectual and spiritual pride that can affect even sincere seekers of truth. The scholar who becomes attached to their own learning, the mystic who becomes proud of their spiritual experiences, and the philosopher who becomes confident in their rational demonstrations all create barriers that prevent the kind of humble receptivity necessary for genuine illumination. The process of purification involves both negative and positive aspects. Negatively, It requires the systematic elimination of spiritual diseases that cloud the heart's natural clarity and prevent it from functioning as a clear mirror for divine light. This involves not only avoiding obviously sinful behavior, but cultivating the kind of sensitive spiritual awareness that can detect and eliminate subtle forms of selfishness and self-deception. Positively, purification involves the cultivation of spiritual qualities that prepare consciousness for higher forms of knowledge. These include humility, which opens the heart to guidance from sources beyond the individual ego; gratitude, which recognizes that all genuine knowledge comes as a gift rather than personal achievement; patience, which sustains spiritual effort through periods of dryness and difficulty; and love, which provides the motivation for the kind of complete surrender necessary for ultimate realization. Al-Ghazali's treatment of love as an epistemological as well as emotional phenomenon represents one of his most original contributions to philosophical psychology. He shows how love involves a unique form of knowledge that combines intellectual understanding with experiential participation. The lover knows the beloved in ways that transcend purely conceptual knowledge without becoming irrational or anti-intellectual. Similarly, the spiritual seeker who develops genuine love for ultimate reality gains access to forms of knowledge about the divine nature that remain closed to purely academic investigation. But Al-Ghazali is careful to distinguish genuine spiritual love from emotional enthusiasm or sentimental religiosity. True love for God involves the complete reorientation of human will and desire toward their ultimate source and goal. This reorientation produces profound changes in how the person sees reality, understands their relationships with others, and conducts their practical affairs. Someone who claims to love God while remaining unchanged in their character and behavior is deceiving themselves about the nature of their spiritual condition. The culmination of Al-Ghazali's analysis, in the Niche of Lights, is his vision of human consciousness, achieving complete transparency to divine light. In this state, the individual ego does not disappear, but it becomes so aligned with divine will that there is no longer any conflict between personal desire and ultimate truth. The person continues to function as a distinct individual with particular responsibilities and relationships, but their consciousness has been transformed so that they perceive everything from the perspective of divine reality rather than limited personal concerns. Part 6. The Psychology of Transformation. Al-Ghazali's most psychologically sophisticated insights emerge from his detailed analysis of how human consciousness can be systematically transformed from its ordinary state of confusion and spiritual blindness to the clarity and illumination that make genuine knowledge possible. This transformation is not a matter of acquiring new information or developing intellectual skills, though it includes both of these elements. Rather, it involves a fundamental reorientation of the entire personality, affecting how one thinks, feels, perceives and acts in relationship to oneself, others and ultimate reality. The starting point for this analysis is Al-Ghazali's understanding of the human heart as the spiritual center of consciousness. He distinguishes carefully between the physical heart that pumps blood through the body and the spiritual heart that serves as the seat of knowledge, emotion and moral choice. This spiritual heart is what he calls a subtle, tenuous substance of an ethereal spiritual sort that is connected with the physical heart but not reducible to it. The spiritual heart is the real essence of human personality, the center from which all genuine knowledge and meaningful action must flow. In its natural state, the heart possesses an innate capacity to reflect spiritual truth, functioning like a polished mirror that can receive and transmit divine light. But this natural capacity becomes obscured and distorted through the accumulated effects of wrong thinking, destructive emotions, and morally corrupt behavior. The heart's mirror-like surface becomes covered with what Al-Ghazali calls rust and tarnish that prevent it from reflecting spiritual reality clearly. The process of spiritual transformation involves systematically removing these obstructions so that the heart can resume its natural function as a receiver and transmitter of divine illumination. Al-Ghazali identifies several major categories of spiritual disease that prevent the heart from achieving its natural clarity. The first category involves what he calls the diseases of belief, which include all forms of intellectual error that distort understanding of fundamental truths about reality. These range from crude superstitions and obviously false beliefs to sophisticated philosophical errors that can deceive even brilliant thinkers. The remedy for diseases of belief is sound knowledge based on revelation, reason, and authentic spiritual experience working together in proper harmony. But intellectual correction alone is insufficient for spiritual transformation, because most spiritual diseases involve the emotions and the will rather than mere intellectual confusion. The second category consists of emotional diseases that create distorted relationships between the self and external reality. These include not only obvious emotional problems like uncontrolled anger, paralyzing fear, and chronic depression, but subtle emotional distortions that can affect even apparently well-adjusted people. Pride represents perhaps the most dangerous of all emotional diseases because it corrupts the very faculty of spiritual discernment that should guide the seeker toward truth. The proud person becomes so attached to their own opinions, achievements and status that they cannot recognize their limitations or accept guidance from sources beyond their personal understanding. Al-Ghazali shows how pride can disguise itself in apparently virtuous forms. The scholar who takes pride in their learning, the mystic who becomes attached to their spiritual experiences, the moral reformer who becomes self-righteous about their ethical commitments. The remedy for pride involves cultivating genuine humility through practices that reveal the fundamental dependence of human consciousness on sources of knowledge and power beyond individual control. Regular contemplation of death reminds the proud person of their ultimate powerlessness and the temporary nature of all human achievements. Service to others, particularly those who cannot provide anything in return, helps break down the barriers of self-centeredness that feed prideful attitudes. Most importantly, systematic self-examination reveals the self-deceptive tendencies of the ego and the subtle ways that pride can corrupt even sincere efforts at spiritual development. Envy represents another major emotional disease that Al-Ghazali analyzes with remarkable psychological insight. The envious person suffers from the good fortune of others and takes pleasure in their misfortunes, creating a fundamentally distorted relationship with the social world. But Al-Ghazali shows that envy is ultimately self-destructive because it prevents the envious person from appreciating the good qualities in others that could serve as models for their own development. Moreover, envy reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of divine justice and mercy, as if God's blessings were a limited resource that must be rationed carefully rather than an unlimited gift that increases when shared. The remedy for envy involves developing what Al-Ghazali calls spiritual magnanimity, the capacity to rejoice genuinely in the success and happiness of others. This is not merely a matter of suppressing envious feelings through willpower, but of cultivating a different understanding of one's relationship to others and to ultimate reality. When consciousness expands beyond narrow self-interest to include genuine concern for the welfare of all conscious beings, envy becomes literally impossible because the success of others is experienced as one's own success. Anger presents particularly complex challenges because it can serve constructive as well as destructive functions. Righteous anger at injustice and moral corruption can motivate necessary reforms and protective actions. But uncontrolled anger destroys the inner peace and clarity of judgment necessary for effective moral action. Al-Ghazali shows how to distinguish between legitimate anger that serves justice and destructive anger that serves only the ego's desire for dominance and revenge. The transformation of anger requires developing what he calls spiritual strength, the capacity to respond to provocations with wisdom rather than mere emotional reaction. This involves not the suppression of all strong feeling, but the rechanneling of emotional energy in service of higher purposes. The spiritually strong person can act decisively against injustice without being controlled by personal resentment or hatred. Greed and attachment to worldly goods represent spiritual diseases that are particularly difficult to cure in a society that celebrates material success and consumption. Al-Ghazali analyzes the psychology of greed with remarkable sophistication, showing how it reflects not genuine appreciation for the goods of this world, but a desperate attempt to find security and satisfaction through accumulating possessions. The greedy person is never satisfied because they are trying to meet spiritual needs through material means, which is like trying to quench thirst by drinking salt water. The cure for greed involves developing what Al-Ghazali calls spiritual poverty, the recognition that genuine security and satisfaction can come only through reliance on divine providence rather than personal accumulation. This does not necessarily require literal poverty or the rejection of all material goods, but rather a fundamental reorientation of attitude toward possessions. The spiritually poor person uses material goods as tools for serving higher purposes, rather than as sources of ultimate meaning and security. But Al-Ghazali's analysis goes beyond individual emotional diseases to examine the systematic distortions of consciousness that prevent most people from recognizing their spiritual condition. He shows how the ordinary state of human consciousness is characterized by what he calls spiritual sleep, a condition in which people remain largely unconscious of their deepest needs and highest possibilities. They pursue goals and engage in activities that provide temporary satisfaction but do not address the fundamental spiritual emptiness that drives all genuine human striving. The process of spiritual awakening involves developing the kind of self-awareness that can recognize these deeper patterns and begin the systematic work of transformation. This requires what Al-Ghazali calls vigilant self-examination, the practice of regularly monitoring one's thoughts, emotions, motivations and actions to detect signs of spiritual disease and track progress in spiritual development. But this self-examination must be balanced with trust in divine mercy and guidance, lest it become a form of spiritual narcissism that focuses attention on the self rather than opening consciousness to transcendent reality. Part 7. The Science of the Heart. At the center of Al-Ghazali's philosophical psychology lies his revolutionary understanding of the heart as an organ of knowledge that operates according to discoverable principles and can be systematically trained to achieve higher levels of perception and understanding. This is not the sentimental romanticism that reduces spiritual knowledge to mere feeling, nor the crude materialism that identifies consciousness with brain states. Rather, Al-Ghazali develops a sophisticated science of the heart that shows how this spiritual faculty can be purified, educated and refined so that it becomes capable of direct perception of spiritual truths that remain hidden from ordinary consciousness. The heart's epistemological function operates through what Al-Ghazali calls spiritual perception, a form of knowledge that combines elements of sensory experience, rational analysis, and mystical intuition without being reducible to any of these ordinary modes of cognition. Just as the physical eye can perceive colors and shapes that exist independently of the perceiver, the spiritual heart can perceive aspects of reality that are objectively present but normally hidden from consciousness. These include not only what we might call religious or mystical realities, but also moral and aesthetic qualities that play crucial roles in human life, but cannot be adequately analyzed through purely rational methods. The heart's natural capacity for spiritual perception becomes obscured through what Al-Ghazali calls the accumulation of rust and tarnish that results from wrong thinking, destructive emotions, and morally corrupt behavior. This is not a punishment imposed from outside, but the natural consequence of activities that are incompatible with the heart's spiritual function. Just as looking at the sun can damage physical vision, or listening to extremely loud sounds can impair hearing, engaging in spiritually destructive activities damages the heart's capacity for spiritual perception. But unlike physical damage, spiritual damage to the heart can be reversed through appropriate remedial practices. Al-Ghazali describes in detail the process of spiritual healing that can restore the heart's natural clarity and receptivity. This process begins with recognition of the problem, which requires the kind of honest self-examination that most people avoid because it threatens their comfortable illusions about their spiritual condition. The person must be willing to acknowledge that their ordinary way of seeing and understanding reality is fundamentally distorted and that they need to undergo a systematic process of transformation. The first stage of this transformation involves what Al-Ghazali calls repentance. But his understanding of repentance goes far beyond conventional notions of feeling sorry for particular wrongdoings. True repentance involves a fundamental reorientation of consciousness away from reliance on personal understanding and control toward complete dependence on divine guidance and mercy. It includes intellectual repentance, which involves abandoning false beliefs and opinions that distort understanding of reality. Emotional repentance, which involves purifying destructive feelings and cultivating constructive ones. And volitional repentance, which involves redirecting the will away from selfish pursuits towards service of ultimate truth. This comprehensive repentance creates the psychological space necessary for the second stage of transformation, which Al-Ghazali calls spiritual discipline or riyada. This involves the systematic practice of specific exercises designed to strengthen the heart's capacity for spiritual perception while weakening the influence of distracting thoughts and desires. These exercises include both external practices like regular prayer, fasting, and charitable giving, and internal practices like meditation, remembrance of God, and contemplation of ultimate questions. But Al-Ghazali emphasizes that spiritual discipline must be guided by sound knowledge rather than mere enthusiasm or blind imitation of others. Different people require different practices depending on their temperament, life circumstances, and level of spiritual development. What helps one person may harm another, and practices that are appropriate at one stage of development may become obstacles at a later stage. This is why the seeker needs access to a qualified spiritual guide who can provide individualized instruction based on deep knowledge of both spiritual principles and human psychology. The third stage of transformation involves what Al-Ghazali calls spiritual realization or tahqiq, the direct experience of spiritual truths that have previously been known only through concepts or beliefs. This is not a single dramatic event, but an ongoing process in which the heart's capacity for spiritual perception gradually increases until it becomes capable of direct awareness of ultimate reality. At this stage, the person no longer needs to rely primarily on external authorities or rational arguments to know fundamental truths about the nature of reality and the proper conduct of life. Instead, they can perceive these truths directly through the heart's spiritual vision. But Al-Ghazali is careful to distinguish genuine spiritual realization from various counterfeit states that can deceive even sincere seekers. Emotional enthusiasm, imaginative fantasies, and psychological abnormalities can all produce experiences that seem spiritually significant, but actually represent forms of self-deception rather than authentic spiritual perception. The criterion for distinguishing authentic from counterfeit spiritual states is their practical consequences. Genuine spiritual realization always produces increased wisdom, compassion, and moral excellence, while counterfeit states typically lead to spiritual pride, emotional instability, and deterioration of character. Al-Ghazali's analysis of the heart's cognitive function includes detailed investigation of the relationship between spiritual perception and ordinary rational thought. He shows how genuine spiritual realization enhances rather than eliminates the capacity for clear thinking and sound judgment. The person whose heart has been purified and illuminated becomes more, not less, capable of understanding complex intellectual problems and making wise practical decisions. Spiritual perception provides access to principles and perspectives that make rational analysis more effective rather than replacing it with irrational enthusiasm. This integration of spiritual perception with rational analysis produces what Al-Ghazali calls spiritual intelligence, a form of wisdom that can navigate successfully between the extremes of cold rationalism and sentimental emotionalism. Spiritual intelligence includes the capacity to understand when rational analysis is appropriate and when it must be supplemented by other forms of knowledge. It also includes sensitivity to the spiritual dimensions of apparently mundane problems and the practical implications of apparently abstract spiritual principles. The ultimate goal of the heart's development is what Al-Ghazali calls spiritual transparency, a state in which individual consciousness becomes completely aligned with ultimate truth without losing its distinctive personal characteristics. The spiritually transparent person continues to function as a unique individual with particular talents, interests, and responsibilities. But their personal perspective has been so expanded and clarified that they perceive everything from the standpoint of ultimate reality rather than narrow self-interest. They become, in effect, windows through which divine light can illuminate the world while remaining authentic human beings rather than depersonalized abstractions. Part 8. The Alchemy of Happiness. In his Persian masterwork, written specifically for a broader audience beyond specialized scholars, Al-Ghazali presents his mature understanding of human happiness as the ultimate goal of all philosophical inquiry and spiritual practice. The Alchemy of Happiness represents not a simplification of his earlier Arabic works, but a distillation that captures the essential, practical wisdom of his entire intellectual and spiritual journey. The title itself is carefully chosen. Like the medieval alchemists who sought to transform base metals into gold through precise knowledge of natural processes, Al-Ghazali shows how the human soul can be transformed from its ordinary condition of confusion and spiritual poverty into the golden state of genuine happiness through understanding and application of spiritual principles. Al-Ghazali begins with a fundamental question that drives all serious human reflection. What is the true nature of happiness, and how can it be reliably achieved? He observes that everyone seeks happiness instinctively, but most people pursue it through means that actually lead away from, rather than towards, genuine satisfaction. They assume that happiness consists in the gratification of physical desires, the accumulation of material possessions, the achievement of social status, or the satisfaction of intellectual curiosity. While these pursuits can provide temporary pleasure and may serve legitimate functions in human life, they cannot provide the kind of lasting fulfillment that the human soul ultimately seeks. The problem is not with these pursuits themselves, but with the assumption that they can provide ultimate satisfaction. Al-Ghazali shows how each of these apparent goods contains internal limitations that prevent it from fulfilling the soul's deepest needs. Physical pleasures are temporary and require constant renewal. Material possessions can be lost and never provide lasting security. Social status depends on the opinions of others and can change unpredictably. Intellectual achievements, however impressive, leave the deeper questions about meaning and purpose unanswered. True happiness, according to Al-Ghazali's analysis, must be based on something that transcends these temporal and contingent goods. It must be grounded in the soul's relationship to that which is eternal, infinite, and absolutely reliable. This means that genuine happiness can come only through knowledge and love of ultimate reality, which religious traditions call God, and which philosophers approach through various concepts like the absolute, the one, or pure being. But this knowledge cannot remain merely theoretical or abstract. It must become experiential and transformative if it is to produce the kind of happiness that satisfies the soul's deepest longings. Al-Ghazali organizes his analysis around 4 fundamental types of knowledge that constitute the components of spiritual alchemy. Each type of knowledge builds upon the others in a systematic progression that leads from ordinary consciousness to direct awareness of ultimate reality. But this is not merely an intellectual progression. Each stage involves practical transformation of how one thinks, feels, and acts in relationship to oneself, others, and the world. The first component is knowledge of the self, which involves understanding the true nature of human consciousness and its relationship to the physical body. Most people identify themselves with their bodies, emotions, thoughts, or social roles. But Al-Ghazali shows that the real self is the spiritual essence that uses these various instruments without being reducible to any of them. This spiritual self has capacities and needs that cannot be satisfied through purely physical or social activities. Understanding this distinction is crucial because efforts to find ultimate satisfaction through bodily pleasures or external achievements are doomed to failure when they are based on fundamental misunderstanding of what the self actually is. But knowledge of the self must go beyond abstract understanding to include practical wisdom about how to manage the relationship between the spiritual essence and its various instruments. The body has legitimate needs that must be met. Emotions provide valuable information that must be interpreted correctly. Thoughts serve important functions that must be guided wisely. And social relationships create responsibilities that must be fulfilled conscientiously. The art of spiritual living involves learning to use all these aspects of human experience in service of the soul's ultimate purpose without becoming enslaved to any of them. The second component is knowledge of God, which involves understanding the divine attributes and their relationship to creation. But Al-Ghazali emphasizes that this knowledge must begin with recognizing the limitations of human concepts when applied to ultimate reality. All human language and thought operates through finite categories that cannot adequately capture the infinite nature of divine reality. This does not mean that we cannot have genuine knowledge of God, but rather that our knowledge must include recognition of its own limitations and openness to forms of understanding that transcend purely conceptual analysis. Knowledge of God includes understanding the divine names and attributes that are revealed through Scripture and can be confirmed through rational reflection and spiritual experience. These include attributes like absolute existence, perfect knowledge, unlimited power, complete wisdom, and infinite mercy. But the purpose of understanding these attributes is not merely intellectual satisfaction, rather it is to guide the seeker in developing corresponding qualities in their own character, insofar as this is possible for finite beings. The person who truly understands divine mercy becomes more merciful. The one who grasps divine wisdom becomes wiser. The one who appreciates divine beauty becomes more beautiful in character. The third component is knowledge of this world as it really is, which involves seeing through the illusions and deceptions that normally distort human perception of temporal reality. Most people see the world as a collection of independent objects and events that can provide ultimate satisfaction if approached correctly. But Al-Ghazali shows that the world is actually a complex system of signs and symbols that point beyond themselves to spiritual realities. Everything in the physical universe serves as a mirror, reflecting aspects of divine reality. And the person who learns to read these signs correctly can find spiritual instruction everywhere. This does not mean that the physical world is illusory or worthless, but rather that its true value lies in its capacity to serve spiritual purposes rather than in its apparent capacity to provide ultimate satisfaction. The beauties of nature can awaken appreciation for divine beauty. The regularities of physical processes can inspire awe at divine wisdom. The interdependence of all created things can teach lessons about the unity that underlies apparent diversity. But these spiritual lessons can be learned only by those who approach the world with the right attitude and understanding. The fourth component is knowledge of the next world as it really is, which involves understanding the ultimate destiny of human consciousness beyond physical death. Al-Ghazali shows that this knowledge is not merely about what happens after death, but about the eternal dimension of consciousness that exists even now, but is normally hidden from awareness. The next world is not simply a different location where consciousness continues after leaving the body. Rather, it represents the full realization of spiritual potentials that can begin to be actualized even in this life. Understanding the next world correctly transforms how one approaches present responsibilities and opportunities. Someone who grasps the eternal consequences of present choices naturally develops different priorities and perspectives than someone who assumes that death ends all consciousness and accountability. But this knowledge must be balanced with appropriate attention to legitimate worldly concerns. The goal is integration rather than escapism. The person who truly understands the next world becomes more, not less, effective in serving constructive purposes in this world. Al-Ghazali shows how these four types of knowledge work together, like the components of an alchemical formula, to transform the soul from its base condition of spiritual ignorance to the golden state of direct awareness of ultimate reality. This transformation cannot be accomplished through intellectual study alone, though sound understanding provides necessary guidance. It requires systematic practice of spiritual disciplines that gradually purify the heart and prepare it to receive divine illumination. But neither can it be accomplished through spiritual practice alone without the guidance that comes from sound knowledge. Blind enthusiasm often leads to self-deception rather than genuine realization. The ultimate happiness that results from this alchemical transformation is qualitatively different from any form of satisfaction available through temporal pursuits. It does not depend on external circumstances and cannot be destroyed by changes in health, wealth, social status, or even physical death. It provides the kind of complete fulfillment that makes all other goods appear as pleasant additions rather than desperate necessities. Most importantly, it naturally expresses itself in increased service to others and greater effectiveness in fulfilling the constructive purposes for which human beings were created. Part 9. The Integration of Paths. The crowning achievement of Al-Ghazali's philosophical career lies not in any single insight or argument, but in his unprecedented integration of different approaches to knowledge and spiritual development that had previously been considered incompatible or mutually exclusive. He showed how rigorous rational inquiry, authentic mystical experience, faithful adherence to revealed guidance, and effective engagement with practical social responsibilities could work together in a comprehensive approach to human flourishing that honors the complexity of human nature and the multidimensional character of reality. This integration was not achieved through superficial compromise or vague generalities that avoid difficult questions, but through penetrating analysis of the legitimate scope and necessary limitations of each approach. Al-Ghazali understood that conflicts between reason and revelation, individual spiritual development and social responsibility, or mystical experience and practical action typically arise from misunderstanding the proper function and appropriate limits of each domain rather than from genuine incompatibility. When each approach is understood correctly and practiced within its proper sphere, they complement and strengthen each other rather than competing for exclusive authority. His integration of reason and revelation provides perhaps the most sophisticated solution to this perennial problem in the history of religious thought. Al-Ghazali shows that genuine rational inquiry leads naturally toward the kinds of questions that can only be answered adequately through revealed guidance, while authentic revelation provides the framework within which rational investigation can operate most effectively. Reason can demonstrate the existence of God, the possibility of prophecy, and the necessity of moral accountability, but it cannot determine the specific content of divine commands or the detailed structure of spiritual development. Revelation provides this specific guidance while confirming and building upon the general conclusions that reason can reach independently. This means that conflicts between reason and revelation typically indicate either inadequate rational analysis or misunderstanding of revealed teachings rather than genuine contradiction between the two sources of knowledge. When reason appears to contradict revelation, the careful investigator should examine whether their rational arguments are actually sound or whether they are interpreting revealed texts correctly. Al-Ghazali's own critique of the philosophers illustrates this principle. He showed that their apparently rational objections to revealed teachings were based on unproven philosophical assumptions rather than rigorous logical demonstration. Similarly, his integration of individual spiritual development with social responsibility addresses one of the most persistent tensions in religious and philosophical thought. Some traditions emphasize the importance of individual spiritual realization, sometimes to the point of encouraging withdrawal from social engagement and worldly responsibilities. Other traditions focus on social justice and communal obligations, sometimes in ways that seem to neglect the inner transformation necessary for authentic moral action. Al-Ghazali shows that these approaches are complementary rather than competitive when understood correctly. Genuine individual spiritual development necessarily leads to increased capacity for effective service to others and greater commitment to social justice and communal welfare. The person whose consciousness has been expanded through authentic spiritual practice naturally develops greater empathy, wisdom, and moral sensitivity that enhance their ability to contribute constructively to social life. Conversely, sincere engagement with social responsibilities, particularly service to those who cannot reciprocate, provides opportunities for spiritual growth that are difficult to find in purely individual practice. The challenges of family life, economic activity, and civic participation create occasions for developing patience, humility, and selflessness that are essential components of spiritual maturity. Al-Ghazali's integration of mystical experience with practical action addresses another common source of confusion in spiritual development. Some people assume that mystical experience necessarily leads to withdrawal from ordinary human activities and responsibilities, while others suspect that claims to mystical experience are forms of escapism or self-deception. Al-Ghazali shows that authentic mystical experience actually enhances rather than diminishes the capacity for effective practical action. The person who has achieved direct awareness of ultimate reality gains access to sources of wisdom, strength, and motivation that make them more rather than less capable of serving constructive purposes in the world. But he also provides detailed criteria for distinguishing authentic mystical experience from various counterfeit states that can deceive even sincere seekers. Genuine mystical realization always produces increased moral excellence, greater wisdom in practical affairs, and enhanced capacity for service to others. States that lead to spiritual pride, emotional instability, or neglect of legitimate worldly responsibilities are not authentic mystical experiences, regardless of how dramatic or subjectively convincing they may seem. This integration extends to Al-Ghazali's understanding of the relationship between different religious and philosophical traditions. Rather than assuming that truth is the exclusive possession of any single tradition, he investigates what each tradition contributes to complete understanding of reality and human flourishing. He finds valuable insights in the work of philosophers, theologians, and mystics, while also identifying the limitations and errors that prevent any single approach from providing complete guidance. This Catholic spirit reflects not relativistic indifference to questions of truth and error, but confidence that ultimate truth is sufficiently rich and complex to be approached from multiple angles without losing its essential unity. Al-Ghazali's methodological integration provides a model for addressing contemporary conflicts between different approaches to knowledge and human development. His example shows how to maintain rigorous standards for evaluating truth claims while remaining open to forms of knowledge that transcend the limitations of any single investigative method. He demonstrates how to honor the legitimate achievements of rational inquiry while recognizing that reason alone cannot answer the deepest questions about meaning, purpose, and value. He shows how to appreciate the importance of individual spiritual development without neglecting social responsibilities or falling into narcissistic preoccupation with personal spiritual states. Most importantly, Al-Ghazali's integration is not merely theoretical, but thoroughly practical. He provides detailed guidance about how to implement this comprehensive approach in the actual circumstances of human life. His revival of the religious sciences shows how every aspect of daily existence, from the most intimate personal practices to the most complex social relationships, can become occasions for spiritual growth and service to ultimate truth. This practical wisdom makes his philosophical insights accessible to people regardless of their level of formal education or specialized knowledge. The enduring relevance of Al-Ghazali's integrative approach reflects the perennial character of the problems he addresses. Human beings in every age and culture face similar challenges in trying to understand the relationship between reason and faith, individual development and social responsibility, spiritual aspiration and practical necessities. Al-Ghazali's solutions to these problems remain valuable because they are based on profound understanding of human nature and reality rather than merely conventional responses to temporary cultural conditions. His integration provides a framework that can be applied creatively to new circumstances while maintaining fidelity to the essential principles that make human flourishing possible. Part 10. The Mirror of Divine Names. Al-Ghazali's most profound theological contribution emerges from his systematic analysis of the divine names and attributes, which he transforms from abstract doctrinal concepts into practical principles for human spiritual development and ethical conduct. Rather than treating the 99 beautiful names of God as merely descriptive labels for divine qualities that remain forever beyond human experience, he shows how these names represent both the ultimate nature of reality and the highest potentials of human consciousness, when properly understood and appropriately realized. His approach to the divine names reflects his characteristic integration of rigorous intellectual analysis with transformative spiritual practice. Each name reveals an aspect of ultimate reality that the human consciousness can approach through specific forms of knowledge, devotional practice, and ethical behavior. But this approach requires careful discrimination between the ways that divine qualities can be reflected in human character and the ways that they remain absolutely unique to divine nature. The person who seeks to embody divine mercy must understand the difference between finite human compassion and the infinite divine compassion that serves as both its source and ultimate standard. Consider Al-Ghazali's analysis of the divine name Ar-Rahman, usually translated as the compassionate or the merciful. At the level of intellectual understanding, this name indicates that ultimate reality is characterized by boundless concern for the welfare of all created beings, rather than indifferent neutrality or arbitrary favoritism. This has profound implications for how human beings should understand their relationship to the universe and their responsibilities toward other conscious beings. If ultimate reality is fundamentally compassionate, then human actions that increase compassion align with the basic structure of existence, while actions that increase cruelty or indifference work against the fundamental grain of reality. But intellectual understanding of divine compassion must be complemented by practical cultivation of compassionate qualities in human character. This is not simply a matter of trying to be kind to others out of moral duty, though ethical behavior provides necessary foundation for spiritual development. Rather, it involves a systematic transformation of consciousness that gradually removes the barriers of selfishness, fear, and spiritual blindness that prevent the natural flow of compassionate response to the suffering of others. As these barriers are removed, compassionate action becomes as natural and spontaneous as breathing, rather than a forced effort to behave correctly. The cultivation of divine qualities in human character requires what Al-Ghazali calls spiritual chemistry, a precise understanding of how different practices and mental attitudes interact to produce specific transformations in consciousness. Just as physical chemistry involves understanding how different substances combine under specific conditions to create new compounds with different properties, spiritual chemistry involves understanding how different spiritual practices combine to create new qualities of character and awareness. The development of genuine compassion, for example, requires the combination of several different elements working together in proper proportion. Intellectual understanding of the causes of suffering provides the cognitive foundation for compassionate response. Emotional sensitivity to the pain of others provides the motivational energy necessary for sustained compassionate action. Practical wisdom about effective methods of helping others ensures that compassionate intentions translate into genuinely beneficial results, rather than mere good intentions that may actually cause harm. Spiritual strength provides the inner resources necessary to maintain compassionate responses even in the face of ingratitude, misunderstanding, or personal sacrifice. But Al-Ghazali's analysis goes deeper than individual character development to explore how divine names reveal the fundamental structure of reality itself. The name Al-Hakim, the Wise, indicates that existence is not a random collection of unrelated events, but a coherent system organized according to principles of divine wisdom that human intelligence can partially understand and consciously cooperate with. This has profound implications for how human beings approach both theoretical questions about the nature of reality and practical questions about how to live most effectively. If reality is fundamentally wise rather than arbitrary or chaotic, then human efforts to understand truth and create beneficial outcomes are working with rather than against the basic tendencies of existence. This provides both confidence that genuine truth can be discovered through sincere inquiry and motivation to persist in seeking wisdom even when immediate results are not apparent. It also suggests that actions based on sound wisdom are more likely to succeed than actions based on mere cleverness, emotional impulse, or conventional opinion. The divine name Al-Jamil, the Beautiful, reveals that ultimate reality is characterized by perfect harmony, proportion, and aesthetic excellence, rather than crude functionality or utilitarian efficiency. This suggests that human beings find their deepest satisfaction not in maximizing pleasure or minimizing pain, but in participating in the creation and appreciation of genuine beauty that reflects divine aesthetic perfection. But Al-Ghazali's understanding of beauty goes far beyond superficial aesthetics to include the beauty of character, the beauty of truthful speech, the beauty of just social arrangements, and the beauty of consciousness that has been purified and illuminated through spiritual discipline. The cultivation of spiritual beauty requires developing what Al-Ghazali calls aesthetic sensitivity, the capacity to distinguish between appearances that merely please the senses or flatter the ego and manifestations of genuine beauty that reflect divine aesthetic perfection. This sensitivity can be developed through contemplation of natural beauty, study of great works of art and literature, and most importantly, association with human beings whose character reflects the beauty of divine qualities. But it also requires the purification of consciousness from the kind of spiritual ugliness that distorts perception and prevents recognition of authentic beauty even when it is present. Al-Ghazali's treatment of the divine name as Saber, the patient, provides particularly profound insights into the relationship between divine temporal transcendence and human temporal existence. Divine patience does not indicate that God is slow to act or reluctant to intervene in worldly affairs, but rather that divine wisdom includes perfect understanding of the appropriate timing for all actions and changes. From the perspective of infinite knowledge and unlimited power, there is no urgency about accomplishing particular results within humanly meaningful time frames, because divine purposes operate on scales that transcend human temporal limitations. But human beings who seek to reflect divine patience in their own character and conduct must learn to distinguish between the kind of patience that reflects wisdom and trust in divine timing, and the kind of passivity that reflects laziness, fear, or lack of commitment to constructive change. Spiritual patience includes the capacity to persist in beneficial activities even when immediate results are not visible, to endure difficulties without losing confidence in ultimate divine justice and mercy, and to work for long-term goals that may not be achieved within one's personal lifetime. But it does not include tolerance for injustice, acceptance of preventable suffering, or failure to take appropriate action when action is called for. The integration of all the divine names in human consciousness represents what Al-Ghazali calls the perfect human being, not in the sense of someone who has achieved absolute perfection, but someone whose character reflects the harmony and balance of divine qualities as completely as is possible for finite consciousness. This person embodies divine mercy without sacrificing divine justice, divine compassion without abandoning divine wisdom, divine patience without neglecting divine power, divine beauty without losing divine truth. Such integration requires years of systematic spiritual development guided by sound knowledge and authentic spiritual practice. But it represents the ultimate goal toward which all genuine human striving is directed. The practical implications of this teaching extend to every aspect of human life and social organization. Families, communities, economic systems, and political arrangements all function most effectively when they reflect the balanced integration of divine qualities, rather than emphasizing some divine attributes while neglecting others. A society that emphasizes justice without mercy becomes harsh and rigid. One that emphasizes mercy without justice becomes weak and corrupt. A community that values truth without beauty becomes dry and unappealing. One that pursues beauty without truth becomes superficial and deceptive. Al-Ghazali's analysis of divine names provides both the vision and the practical guidance necessary for creating human institutions that serve authentic human flourishing rather than merely conventional success. Part 11. The Mechanics of Certainty. Al-Ghazali's revolutionary contribution to the theory of knowledge lies in his systematic analysis of different types of certainty and the specific conditions under which each type can be reliably achieved. Rather than treating certainty as a simple binary condition that either exists or does not exist, he develops a sophisticated epistemological framework that distinguishes between multiple levels and forms of certain knowledge, each appropriate to different domains of inquiry, and each requiring different methodological approaches. The foundation of his epistemological system rests on what he calls immediate certainty, the kind of direct, undeniable awareness that consciousness has of its own existence and basic operations. This includes not only the famous insight later developed by Descartes that thinking consciousness cannot coherently doubt its own existence, but also the immediate awareness that consciousness has of its capacity for knowledge, its ability to distinguish between different mental states, and its fundamental orientation toward truth rather than falsehood. This immediate certainty provides the foundation upon which all other forms of knowledge must be built, because any attempt to doubt or question it necessarily presupposes the very capacities it describes. But Al-Ghazali shows that immediate certainty, while absolutely reliable within its proper domain, has significant limitations that prevent it from providing complete guidance for human understanding and action. Consciousness can be certain of its own existence and basic capacities, but it cannot be certain through immediate awareness alone whether its perceptions correspond to external reality, whether its reasoning processes track objective truth, or whether its moral intuitions reflect genuine values rather than mere personal preferences or cultural conditioning. These questions require different types of investigation that build upon but go beyond immediate certainty. The second level in Al-Ghazali's epistemological hierarchy consists of what he calls demonstrative certainty, the kind of knowledge achieved through rigorous, logical analysis based on clearly established premises. This includes mathematical truths, logical principles, and properly conducted empirical investigations that follow sound methodological procedures. Demonstrative certainty can extend reliable knowledge far beyond the limited domain of immediate certainty, providing understanding of complex relationships, predictions about future events, and general principles that apply across different particular cases. Al-Ghazali's analysis of demonstrative certainty reveals both its impressive achievements and its inherent limitations. Within appropriate domains, demonstrative reasoning can achieve results that are as certain as immediate awareness and far more extensive in their scope and practical utility. Mathematical demonstrations, for example, can establish relationships between quantities that hold true regardless of time, place, or the psychological characteristics of individual thinkers. Properly conducted empirical investigations can discover patterns in natural processes that enable reliable prediction and effective practical intervention. but demonstrative certainty depends on premises that cannot themselves be established through demonstration without falling into circular reasoning or infinite regress. The axioms of mathematics, the principles of logic, and the basic assumptions of empirical methodology must be accepted on grounds other than demonstrative proof if demonstration is to be possible at all. Moreover, demonstrative reasoning can establish relationships between concepts and correlations between observed phenomena, but it cannot penetrate to the essential nature of reality itself or answer ultimate questions about meaning, purpose, and value. This analysis leads Al-Ghazali to identify a third level of certainty that he calls intuitive certainty, achieved through direct spiritual perception of truths that transcend both immediate consciousness and demonstrative reasoning while remaining compatible with both. Intuitive certainty provides access to knowledge about ultimate reality, fundamental values, and the deeper meaning of existence that cannot be achieved through purely rational analysis, but can be confirmed and supported by rational reflection when properly understood. The possibility of intuitive certainty depends on what Al-Ghazali calls the purification and illumination of consciousness through systematic spiritual discipline. Just as mathematical reasoning requires training in logical procedures, and empirical investigation requires development of observational skills, spiritual perception requires cultivation of specific capacities and elimination of specific obstacles that normally prevent consciousness from functioning at this higher level. The heart must be purified of spiritual diseases like pride, greed, and hatred that distort perception, and it must be strengthened through practices like meditation, prayer, and moral discipline that enhance its natural capacity for spiritual vision. Al-Ghazali provides detailed analysis of the criteria that can be used to distinguish genuine intuitive certainty from various counterfeit states that may seem similar but actually represent forms of self-deception, wishful thinking, or psychological abnormality. Authentic intuitive knowledge always proves compatible with sound rational analysis and accurate empirical observation when these are properly conducted within their appropriate domains. It also produces practical consequences that enhance rather than diminish the person's capacity for wise judgment, ethical behavior, and effective action in the world. States that contradict well-established rational or empirical knowledge, or that lead to deterioration in character and practical judgment, are not authentic intuitive perceptions regardless of how subjectively convincing they may seem. The integration of these three levels of certainty creates what Al-Ghazali calls complete knowledge, a form of understanding that honors the legitimate achievements of rational inquiry and empirical investigation, while recognizing that these approaches must be complemented by spiritual insight if human knowledge is to address the deepest questions that consciousness naturally raises. Complete knowledge is not achieved by rejecting or minimizing any of the three levels, but by understanding the proper function and appropriate limits of each and learning to integrate their different contributions into a coherent understanding of reality and human purpose. This epistemological framework has profound implications for how human beings should approach education, research, moral decision-making, and spiritual development. Educational systems that focus exclusively on one type of knowledge while neglecting the others produce graduates who are either technically competent but spiritually illiterate, or spiritually sensitive but intellectually undisciplined, or philosophically sophisticated but practically ineffective. Complete education must provide training in logical reasoning, empirical observation, and spiritual perception, along with the wisdom necessary to integrate these different approaches appropriately. Similarly, research programs that limit themselves to purely rational or purely empirical methods may achieve impressive results within narrow domains while missing crucial aspects of reality that can only be accessed through spiritual investigation. Al-Ghazali's approach suggests that the most fruitful research programs will be those that remain open to insights from spiritual perception while maintaining rigorous standards for rational analysis and empirical verification. This does not mean abandoning scientific methodology. but rather expanding it to include forms of investigation that honor the complexity and multidimensional character of reality. Al-Ghazali's analysis of certainty also provides crucial guidance for moral decision-making in complex situations where different ethical principles seem to conflict or where the long-term consequences of actions cannot be predicted with confidence through rational analysis alone. Complete knowledge includes not only understanding of general ethical principles and accurate assessment of particular circumstances, but also spiritual insight into the deeper meaning and ultimate significance of different courses of action. This spiritual dimension of moral knowledge can provide guidance that transcends the limitations of purely rational ethical analysis without contradicting its legitimate conclusions. The ultimate goal of Al-Ghazali's epistemological system is to enable human consciousness to achieve the kind of complete and reliable knowledge that makes authentic human flourishing possible. This requires not only intellectual mastery of complex ideas and practical competence in worldly affairs, but also spiritual realization that provides direct access to the fundamental principles and ultimate purposes that give meaning and direction to all other forms of knowledge and activity. Part 12. The Architecture of Reality. At the heart of Al-Ghazali's philosophical system lies a comprehensive vision of the structure of existence that integrates insights from rational philosophy, mystical experience, and revealed truth into a coherent understanding of how different levels of reality relate to each other and to human consciousness. This metaphysical framework provides the foundation for his contributions to epistemology, ethics, psychology, and spiritual development, showing how questions about knowledge, morality, human nature, and spiritual practice are ultimately grounded in fundamental truths about the nature of existence itself. Al-Ghazali's metaphysical vision begins with the recognition that existence itself is not uniform or homogeneous, but exhibits a hierarchical structure in which different levels of reality possess different degrees of independence, permanence, and causal efficacy. At the apex of this hierarchy stands the divine reality, which alone possesses absolute existence in the sense of depending on nothing outside itself for its reality, permanence, or activity. Divine existence is not one being among others, but the source and sustainer of all other forms of existence, the ultimate reality that makes everything else possible, while remaining perfectly complete and self-sufficient in itself. This understanding of divine transcendence does not lead Al-Ghazali to adopt the kind of abstract philosophical theism that reduces God to a mere logical principle or impersonal absolute. Rather, he shows how divine transcendence is compatible with, and indeed requires, divine immanence in the sense of immediate presence to and intimate involvement with all aspects of created existence. The God who transcends all limitations is precisely the God who can be present everywhere without being confined anywhere, who can know all particular events without being changed by temporal succession, and who can act in the world without being subject to external constraints or internal needs. The second level of Al-Ghazali's metaphysical hierarchy consists of what he calls the spiritual realm, the domain of angels, disembodied souls, and pure spiritual realities that exist independently of material embodiment while remaining completely dependent on divine creative activity for their existence and continuance. This spiritual realm serves as the intermediary between absolute divine reality and the physical universe, transmitting divine influence into the material world while translating the experiences and needs of material creatures back toward their spiritual source. Al-Ghazali's understanding of the spiritual realm reflects his integration of philosophical analysis with mystical experience and scriptural teaching. From a philosophical perspective, the existence of spiritual realities provides a necessary bridge between the absolute simplicity of divine nature and the complex multiplicity of the physical universe. Some form of intermediate reality seems necessary to explain how the divine unity can be the source of worldly multiplicity, without divine nature itself becoming complex or composite. From the perspective of mystical experience, spiritual realities represent levels of consciousness and forms of existence that become accessible to human awareness as it is purified and elevated through spiritual discipline. From the standpoint of revealed teaching, angels and spiritual forces play crucial roles in the divine governance of the universe and the guidance of human beings toward their ultimate spiritual destiny. The third level consists of the physical universe, the realm of material objects, spatial relationships, temporal processes, and causal interactions that provides the immediate environment for human existence and the theatre within which human spiritual development takes place. Al-Ghazali's understanding of physical reality reflects his sophisticated analysis of the relationship between scientific investigation and spiritual insight. The physical universe possesses genuine reality and operates according to discoverable regularities that make scientific knowledge possible and practical intervention effective. But physical reality is not self-existent or self-explanatory. It depends completely on spiritual and ultimately divine reality for its existence, its intelligible structure, and its capacity to serve as a vehicle for spiritual development and divine self-disclosure. This hierarchical understanding of reality enables Al-Ghazali to address one of the most persistent problems in the relationship between religious faith and scientific knowledge: the question of whether spiritual and physical explanations of natural phenomena compete with each other or complement each other. His answer is that they operate on different levels of analysis and serve different explanatory purposes without conflicting when properly understood. Scientific investigation discovers the regular patterns that divine wisdom typically employs in governing natural processes, while spiritual insight penetrates to the ultimate source and final purpose of these patterns. The scientist who discovers that fire burns cotton because of the chemical interaction between oxygen and cellulose has identified the immediate mechanism through which burning occurs. But this discovery does not eliminate the need for spiritual understanding of why a wise and merciful God creates a universe in which such processes are possible and serve constructive purposes. Al-Ghazali's metaphysical framework also addresses fundamental questions about the relationship between necessity and contingency in the structure of existence. He shows that the universe exhibits both necessary and contingent features, but that these exist at different levels and serve different functions in the overall divine plan. Certain fundamental principles, like the basic laws of logic and mathematics, appear to be necessary features of any possible universe because they reflect the structure of divine wisdom itself. Other features, like the particular arrangement of galaxies or the specific course of historical events, are contingent in the sense that they could have been different without violating any necessary principles. But they are not arbitrary because they serve purposes within the overall divine plan that required precisely these arrangements rather than alternatives. This understanding of necessity and contingency provides Al-Ghazali with resources for addressing both philosophical problems about divine freedom and practical questions about human responsibility. If everything in the universe was strictly necessary, divine creative activity would be reduced to logical entailment and human choices would be meaningless illusions. If everything were purely contingent, the universe would lack intelligible structure and moral effort would have no reliable connection to beneficial outcomes. Al-Ghazali shows how divine wisdom creates a universe that is structured enough to be intelligible and reliable, but flexible enough to allow for genuine divine freedom and authentic human choice. The implications of Al-Ghazali's metaphysical vision extend to every aspect of human existence and activity. Understanding the hierarchical structure of reality provides guidance for organizing human priorities, developing educational curricula, structuring social institutions, and pursuing both individual and collective goals. Activities that align with the fundamental structure of reality are more likely to succeed and produce lasting satisfaction than activities that work against this structure. This does not mean that human beings should passively accept whatever happens without trying to improve conditions, but rather that efforts at improvement will be most effective when they cooperate with, rather than oppose the basic tendencies built into the nature of existence itself. Al-Ghazali's metaphysical framework also provides resources for understanding the relationship between time and eternity that has puzzled philosophers and theologians throughout history. Rather than treating time and eternity as simply contradictory, he shows how temporal existence serves as a vehicle through which eternal realities can be experienced and eternal purposes can be accomplished by beings whose consciousness is structured by temporal succession. Human beings exist in time, but they are capable of recognizing timeless truths, forming permanent relationships, and participating in activities that have eternal significance. This temporal-eternal integration makes possible the kind of meaningful existence that satisfies both human need for immediate experience and human longing for ultimate significance. Part 13. The Art of Spiritual Direction. Al-Ghazali's profound understanding of the systematic nature of spiritual development led him to articulate the most sophisticated theory of spiritual guidance and education in Islamic intellectual history. Drawing on his own experience as both seeker and teacher, his careful observation of different types of spiritual temperament, and his systematic study of the methods employed by successful spiritual guides, he developed a comprehensive approach to spiritual direction that addresses the practical challenges faced by anyone attempting to guide others toward spiritual maturity and authentic realization. The foundation of Al-Ghazali's approach to spiritual direction rests on his recognition that spiritual development, like physical and intellectual development, follows discoverable patterns and operates according to identifiable principles that can be systematically applied by qualified practitioners. But spiritual development differs from other forms of human growth in crucial respects that require specialized knowledge and distinctive methodological approaches. Unlike physical growth, which proceeds largely through natural biological processes, or intellectual development, which can be fostered through appropriate educational techniques, spiritual development requires the coordination of human effort with divine grace in ways that cannot be controlled or predicted through purely human methods. This creates what Al-Ghazali calls the paradox of spiritual education. Effective spiritual guidance requires both precise knowledge of natural psychological processes and humble dependence on supernatural divine assistance. The spiritual guide must understand how different practices affect different types of personality, how various spiritual diseases develop and can be cured, and how to recognize the signs of authentic progress versus counterfeit spiritual states. But all this knowledge remains ineffective unless it is applied within the context of genuine spiritual relationship between guide and seeker that serves as a channel for divine influence and guidance. Al-Ghazali's analysis of the qualifications necessary for effective spiritual guidance reflects his characteristic integration of theoretical knowledge with practical experience. The authentic spiritual guide must possess comprehensive knowledge of religious law, theology, and spiritual psychology gained through systematic study with qualified teachers. But intellectual mastery alone is insufficient. The guide must also have personal experience of the spiritual states and stages they seek to foster in others. Someone who has not personally traversed the difficulties and dangers of the spiritual path cannot provide reliable guidance to others attempting the same journey, regardless of how extensive their theoretical knowledge might be. Equally important is the guide's moral character and spiritual maturity. The spiritual guide exercises profound influence over the psychological and spiritual development of seekers who place themselves under their direction. This influence can be used constructively to accelerate spiritual development and avoid dangerous pitfalls, but it can also be misused in ways that cause severe spiritual damage and may require years to repair. Therefore, the authentic guide must have achieved sufficient spiritual purification to be trusted with this kind of responsibility and sufficient spiritual realization to serve as a reliable channel for divine guidance rather than merely personal opinion or preference. Al-Ghazali's approach to the practical methods of spiritual guidance demonstrates his sophisticated understanding of human psychology and his recognition that different people require different approaches depending on their temperament, life circumstances, and level of spiritual development. He identifies several basic spiritual temperaments that require different kinds of guidance and support. Some people are naturally inclined toward rational analysis and require intellectual understanding as the foundation for spiritual practice. Others are more emotionally oriented and develop most effectively through devotional practices that engage the heart directly. Still others have practical temperaments and benefit most from forms of spiritual discipline that integrate contemplative practices with active service to others. But Al-Ghazali warns against the common mistake of assuming that people belong exclusively to one temperamental category throughout their spiritual development. Most individuals exhibit mixed characteristics that require carefully balanced approaches, and even those with clear temperamental inclinations may need to develop capacities that do not come naturally as they advance towards spiritual maturity. The intellectually oriented person must eventually learn to engage the heart and will, not just the mind. The emotionally oriented person must develop discrimination and practical wisdom. The practically oriented person must cultivate contemplative depth and theoretical understanding. This recognition leads Al-Ghazali to emphasize the importance of what he calls graduated instruction, a systematic approach that provides different types of guidance appropriate to different stages of spiritual development. The beginning seeker requires clear, simple instructions about basic practices and fundamental principles, along with encouragement and support to maintain motivation through the inevitable difficulties and dry periods that characterize the early stages of spiritual life. Intermediate students need more sophisticated guidance about how to recognize and overcome subtle spiritual diseases, how to deepen their practice, and how to integrate spiritual insights with their worldly responsibilities. Advanced practitioners require guidance about the most refined spiritual states and the dangers of spiritual pride that can accompany genuine spiritual achievement. Al-Ghazali's treatment of the relationship between individual instruction and community-based spiritual education reflects his understanding that human beings are simultaneously unique individuals and social creatures who develop most effectively within supportive communities. Each seeker requires some degree of individualized attention that addresses their particular needs, circumstances, and spiritual challenges. But purely individual spiritual development can lead to self-deception, spiritual pride, or eccentric deviations that might be corrected through interaction with a community of fellow seekers under qualified guidance. The ideal spiritual education combines individual direction with community participation in ways that provide both the personal attention necessary for addressing individual needs and the social correction necessary for maintaining balance and authenticity. One of Al-Ghazali's most important contributions to the theory of spiritual direction concerns his detailed analysis of the criteria for evaluating spiritual progress and identifying authentic versus counterfeit spiritual states. He recognizes that spiritual development involves subjective experiences that cannot be directly observed or measured by external standards, creating possibilities for self-deception that do not exist in other forms of education. Someone can convince themselves that they have achieved advanced spiritual states when they have actually fallen into subtle forms of spiritual pride, emotional enthusiasm, or psychological abnormality that mimic authentic spiritual experience. Al-Ghazali provides practical tests that can be applied by both guides and seekers to distinguish genuine spiritual progress from counterfeit states. Authentic spiritual development always produces increased moral excellence, greater wisdom in practical affairs, enhanced capacity for service to others, and deeper humility about one's spiritual achievements. States that lead to moral deterioration, practical incompetence, selfish preoccupation, or spiritual arrogance are not authentic spiritual realizations, regardless of how subjectively convincing or emotionally satisfying they may seem. These criteria provide reliable guidance that can prevent both guides and seekers from being misled by spectacular experiences that may actually represent spiritual regression rather than progress. Al-Ghazali's approach to the challenges and responsibilities of spiritual guidance extends beyond technical competence to address the fundamental spiritual and ethical dimensions of the guide-seeker relationship. He shows how effective spiritual guidance requires the guide to maintain constant awareness of their own need for continued spiritual development and dependence on divine guidance. The guide who assumes that they have completed their own spiritual journey and no longer need guidance from higher sources becomes spiritually static and gradually loses the capacity to provide authentic guidance to others. Therefore, the authentic guide maintains their own practices of spiritual discipline, regularly seeks guidance from other qualified sources, and remains constantly aware of their ultimate dependence on divine grace rather than personal competence. Part 14. The Social Dimension. Al-Ghazali's philosophical system extends naturally from individual spiritual development to encompass a comprehensive vision of how authentic spiritual principles should be applied to the organization of family life, economic activity, political governance, and social relationships. Rather than treating spiritual development as a purely private matter that can be separated from social responsibilities, he shows how genuine individual transformation necessarily leads to enhanced capacity for constructive social engagement, while effective social institutions provide the supportive environment necessary for widespread individual spiritual development. His analysis of family life as the fundamental building block of social organization demonstrates his characteristic integration of practical wisdom with spiritual insight. Al-Ghazali shows how marriage and family relationships can serve as vehicles for spiritual growth when approached with appropriate understanding and intentions. The challenges of intimate partnership provide opportunities for developing patience, forgiveness, selflessness, and unconditional love that are difficult to find in other contexts. The responsibilities of raising children create occasions for learning about divine mercy, wisdom, and long-term concern for others' welfare that can deepen understanding of divine qualities and enhance capacity for reflecting them in human relationships. But Al-Ghazali also recognizes that family relationships can become sources of spiritual stagnation or regression when they are approached with purely selfish motivations or managed according to conventional social expectations rather than spiritual principles. Marriages based primarily on physical attraction, social status, or economic advantage may provide temporary satisfaction, but cannot produce the kind of lasting fulfillment that comes from spiritual partnership. Child-rearing approaches that focus exclusively on material success or social conformity without attention to spiritual development may produce worldly achievement but fail to prepare children for the deeper challenges and opportunities of human existence. Al-Ghazali's approach to family life emphasizes what he calls conscious relationship, the practice of approaching intimate partnerships and parental responsibilities as opportunities for mutual spiritual development, rather than merely sources of personal satisfaction or social obligation. This requires both partners to commit themselves to their own individual spiritual growth and to supporting each other's spiritual development, even when this creates temporary inconvenience or challenges conventional relationship patterns. It also requires parents to understand their role as spiritual guides and teachers for their children, not just providers of material needs and social training. The extension of these principles to economic activity produces what Al-Ghazali calls spiritual economics, an approach to wealth creation and distribution that serves human spiritual development rather than merely maximizing material accumulation or satisfying consumer desires. He shows how economic activity can become a form of worship and service when it is motivated by intention to serve divine purposes rather than purely personal profit, when it is conducted according to ethical principles that respect the welfare of all participants, and when its fruits are shared in ways that reduce rather than increase social inequality and spiritual corruption. Al-Ghazali's analysis of wealth and poverty reveals the spiritual dangers inherent in both extreme conditions when they are not approached with appropriate spiritual understanding. Excessive wealth can lead to spiritual corruption through pride, attachment to material goods, and isolation from the struggles and needs of ordinary people. But extreme poverty can also create spiritual problems through desperation, resentment and preoccupation with material survival that leaves little energy for spiritual development. The spiritually optimal economic condition is what he calls conscious sufficiency, having enough material resources to meet legitimate needs and fulfill social responsibilities without having so much that wealth becomes a source of spiritual distraction or moral corruption. This principle has profound implications for both individual economic choices and social economic policy. Individuals should seek levels of wealth that enable them to serve constructive purposes rather than simply maximizing personal accumulation or maintaining conventional lifestyle expectations. Societies should organize their economic systems to promote widespread access to conscious sufficiency rather than creating extreme disparities that prevent some people from meeting basic needs, while enabling others to accumulate wealth far beyond any constructive purpose. Al-Ghazali's approach to political governance reflects his understanding that authentic spiritual principles provide the most reliable foundation for just and effective social organization. Political authority should be exercised by individuals who possess not only practical competence in administration and policy making, but also sufficient spiritual development to resist the corrupting influences of power and to maintain primary commitment to serving the common good rather than personal or factional interests. The ideal political leader combines practical wisdom about effective governance with spiritual wisdom about ultimate human purposes and divine justice. But Al-Ghazali also recognizes that political institutions must be designed to function effectively even when they are administered by people of ordinary spiritual development rather than exceptional spiritual achievement. He advocates for systems of checks and balances that prevent the concentration of excessive power in any individual or group, accountability mechanisms that enable citizens to monitor and correct governmental performance, and educational institutions that prepare people for responsible citizenship and effective leadership. The goal is not to create perfect government administered by spiritually perfect leaders, but to create governmental systems that serve human flourishing as effectively as possible given the limitations and mixed motivations of ordinary human beings. Al-Ghazali's vision of social reform emphasizes what he calls organic transformation, the gradual improvement of social conditions through the accumulated effects of individual spiritual development rather than through radical restructuring of social institutions without corresponding changes in the character and consciousness of the people who operate these institutions. He argues that social problems ultimately stem from individual spiritual problems: greed, hatred, pride, ignorance, and other spiritual diseases in individuals create and sustain unjust economic systems, corrupt political arrangements, and dysfunctional social relationships. Therefore, lasting social improvement requires widespread individual spiritual development that addresses these root causes rather than merely reforming external structures while leaving the underlying spiritual problems unchanged. This does not mean that Al-Ghazali advocates political quietism or accepts unjust social conditions as divinely ordained and therefore unchangeable. Rather, he argues for coordinated individual and social transformation that addresses both personal spiritual development and structural social reform as complementary aspects of a comprehensive approach to human betterment. Individuals should work on their own spiritual purification while also taking appropriate action to improve social conditions. Societies should reform unjust institutions while also creating environments that support individual spiritual development. Al-Ghazali's approach to social diversity and religious pluralism reflects his conviction that authentic spiritual truth is sufficiently universal to provide common ground for cooperation between people of different backgrounds and beliefs, while also being sufficiently rich to accommodate different approaches to spiritual development that serve the varying needs and capacities of different individuals and communities. He advocates for social arrangements that protect the freedom of different groups to pursue their own approaches to spiritual development, while also maintaining common standards of justice, ethical behavior, and mutual respect that enable diverse communities to coexist peacefully and beneficially. The goal is neither homogenization that eliminates valuable diversity, nor fragmentation that prevents beneficial cooperation, but dynamic unity that honors both legitimate differences and fundamental commonalities in human spiritual nature and needs. Part 15. The Eternal Teaching. The culmination of Al-Ghazali's philosophical journey reveals itself not in any single doctrine or argument, but in his demonstration that the deepest human questions about knowledge, reality, morality, and meaning can be addressed satisfactorily only through an integrated approach that honors both the legitimate demands of rational inquiry and the irreplaceable insights of authentic spiritual experience. His lasting contribution to human understanding lies in showing how these apparently different approaches to truth can work together synergistically rather than competing for exclusive authority over the territory of ultimate questions. Al-Ghazali's synthesis transcends the limitations of purely rational philosophy without rejecting the legitimate achievements of human reasoning. He shows how rational analysis can provide necessary preparation for spiritual insight by training consciousness in careful observation, logical discrimination, and systematic investigation. But he also demonstrates that rational analysis alone cannot penetrate to the essential nature of ultimate reality, or provide the kind of transformative knowledge that satisfies the deepest needs of human consciousness. The integration of rational and spiritual approaches creates possibilities for understanding that neither approach can achieve independently. This integration requires what Al-Ghazali calls intellectual humility, the recognition that human reasoning, however sophisticated and carefully conducted, operates within limitations that prevent it from achieving complete and final understanding of ultimate questions. Intellectual humility does not involve abandoning rational standards or accepting contradictory propositions, but rather maintaining openness to forms of knowledge that transcend purely conceptual analysis while remaining compatible with sound rational conclusions. The intellectually humble person uses reason as far as it can legitimately extend, while recognizing that ultimate truth exceeds the boundaries of purely human understanding. Similarly, Al-Ghazali's approach transcends the limitations of purely individual spirituality without minimizing the importance of personal spiritual development. He shows how authentic individual spiritual realization naturally leads to enhanced capacity for service to others and greater commitment to social justice and communal welfare. The person whose consciousness has been expanded through genuine spiritual practice develops greater empathy, wisdom, and moral sensitivity that enhance rather than diminish their ability to contribute constructively to family, community, and society. Conversely, sincere engagement with social responsibilities provides opportunities for spiritual growth that complement and deepen the insights gained through individual contemplative practice. Al-Ghazali's understanding of the relationship between temporal existence and eternal reality provides resources for addressing one of the most persistent sources of human anxiety and confusion: the question of whether individual human life has ultimate significance or is merely a temporary episode in an indifferent universe. He shows how human consciousness, despite its temporal limitations and finite capacities, can participate in eternal truth through knowledge, love, and service that connect individual existence with ultimate reality. This participation does not eliminate the genuine challenges and sorrows of temporal existence, but it provides the kind of meaning and purpose that enable human beings to endure difficulties and maintain hope, even in the face of apparently overwhelming obstacles. The practical implications of Al-Ghazali's teaching extend to every aspect of human life and activity. His approach provides guidance for organizing educational curricula that honor both intellectual rigor and spiritual development, creating economic systems that serve human flourishing rather than mere accumulation, developing political institutions that promote justice and enable widespread spiritual development, and structuring family and social relationships that support both individual growth and communal welfare. But this guidance is not presented as a rigid blueprint that can be mechanically applied without regard to particular circumstances and cultural contexts. Rather, Al-Ghazali provides principles and methods that can be creatively adapted to different situations while maintaining fidelity to the essential insights that make human flourishing possible. Al-Ghazali's approach to the perennial tension between stability and change reflects his understanding that authentic spiritual principles are both timeless and dynamically applicable to new circumstances. The fundamental structures of human consciousness, the basic requirements for spiritual development, and the essential principles of justice and morality remain constant across different historical periods and cultural contexts. But the specific applications of these principles must be continually reconsidered and reformulated as human knowledge advances, social conditions change, and new challenges and opportunities emerge. The task is not to preserve particular historical formulations unchanged, but to apply timeless principles creatively to contemporary circumstances in ways that serve authentic human flourishing. This dynamic approach to tradition and innovation provides resources for addressing contemporary challenges that require both rootedness in tested wisdom and openness to new insights and possibilities. Al-Ghazali's example shows how to maintain commitment to fundamental spiritual and ethical principles while remaining open to new knowledge about human psychology, social organization, and the structure of physical reality. His integration of different sources of knowledge provides a model for contemporary efforts to address global challenges that require both advanced technical knowledge and profound wisdom about human nature and ultimate purposes. The ultimate significance of Al-Ghazali's philosophical achievement lies in his demonstration that the highest human aspirations for knowledge, meaning, and fulfillment are not illusory or impossible, but require the kind of comprehensive approach that integrates all the legitimate capacities of human consciousness in service of ultimate truth. His life and teaching provide evidence that human beings can achieve genuine certainty about fundamental questions, lasting satisfaction through appropriate spiritual development, and effective service to purposes that transcend narrow self-interest. But these achievements require the kind of serious commitment to truth, sustained effort in spiritual development, and humble dependence on divine guidance that most people avoid because they seem too demanding or uncertain in their outcomes. Al-Ghazali's enduring relevance stems from his focus on perennial human concerns that transcend particular historical and cultural contexts while remaining concretely applicable to the specific challenges faced by individuals and societies in every age. The questions he addresses about the relationship between reason and faith, individual development and social responsibility, temporal engagement and eternal significance continue to perplex thoughtful people in every generation. His solutions to these questions remain valuable because they are based on profound understanding of human nature and reality, rather than merely conventional responses to temporary cultural conditions. The path that Al-Ghazali pioneered from skeptical doubt through intellectual mastery to spiritual realization and practical service remains open to anyone willing to undertake the necessary journey with appropriate guidance and sufficient commitment. His example demonstrates that this journey, while demanding and sometimes difficult, leads to forms of knowledge, satisfaction and effectiveness that justify whatever effort and sacrifice may be required. The treasure of integrated wisdom that he discovered through his lifelong search for truth continues to shine as brightly today as it did 9 centuries ago, offering guidance and hope to all who seek authentic answers to life's deepest questions.